let's also pop out a couple of things. Oh, yeah. You're still seeing the Start Soon screen, so I'm gonna transition over. Oh, I don't have my hat on. Don't think you've seen this hat. So, now that's on, I'm now going to pop out another thing to keep an eye on. And now, let's see. Okay, I got all that. I shared it to places I wanted to share. It'll be interesting to check back in onto like my Facebook. That's one thing I want to do. The stream is now live, and I got 2 viewers. They're probably both me, but still. For those of that are in the chat right now that are not me, you can go ahead. You can also go to my Twitter, and the link's down there, and you can promote the stream from there. So yes, we're now into chapter 5 of Direct Action An Ethnography by David Graeber, the late David Graeber. He rests in power. This 2 nights ago, actually, on Thursday, I read the final the diary portion of the book whereas like chapter 4 where we're talking about the summit. And this is why I said on Twitter and on places when I promoted, it's like, hey, even if you haven't catch all of the previous streams where me reading Direct Action Ethnography, you can come in and jump into like this stream as well, because now we're talking about just simply straight theory, as it were, and what anarchists actually mean by direct action, as it were. So I got several beverages. Got some like mayo, just like water flavored and with a bit of caffeine, and I have my black coffee here in a Diablo mug, and again, my older brother has a bunch of gets a bunch of loot crates, so we get some like gaming mugs. But hey, I have tea, so I have a lot of tea. I think everything is all set up, so welcome, and if you're here, thank you for spending your Saturday afternoon, evening, nighttime, morning with me, whatever time it is where you are. Thank you for welcome, and we're going to get into Chapter 5 of Direct Action and Ethnography. Pretty much going with like what may be like this first thing you should do. What is direct action? But let's go on. Chapter 5, Direct Action, Anarchism, and Direct Democracy. Since this book is about direct action, it might be best to begin by explaining what that is. 1. Direct action. Direct action? Over the years, hundreds of anarchists have tried to answer this question in pamphlets, broadsides, and speeches. Here's some sampling. That's right. If you want to read along with me, there is reading. There's the link to the Anarchist Library. And also, if you just type direct action in the search bar for in the Anarchist Library, you get there's a whole category. I bet direct action is such a topic that you can just click on that topic and see all the pamphlets and all the other essays that have been written about direct action right there. And we'll continue. Direct action implies one's acting of oneself in a fashion in which one may weigh directly the problems which you are confronted, and without needing the meditation of politicians or bureaucrats. Like I said in my first stream, that spawned me wanting to read specifically this book, as it were. A couple of reasons. David Graeber just passed away, and tragically, but it's also I want to go through his catalog, his library. This was put up onto the Anarchist Library, but also is I talked to some. I asked questions to some liberals challenging their politics, and one did say, which he later said, I forgot that I said that, that that writing and emailing and writing letters and like calling your representatives, that is a form of direct action. And I was just like, that does not compute to me. And it says it right here, which is like, no, you take the actions upon yourself. You are the one directly acting of your own accord, and not without the meditations of politicians or bureaucrats. So no, writing a letter or calling your representatives is not direct action. But the worst take I saw, which was a liberal said that voting is direct action. And I was just like, so my fears when I'm talking to liberals is that like, oh, the what everything I'm saying goes through a liberal filter, and then they will hear that, but then they'll hear what they want to hear as well. That yes, I'm performing direct action. I'm voting, or helping people with voting. I mean, phone banking, text banking, canvassing when we're not in COVID times. Yeah, that's something. You're actually getting out there and doing work, but it's kind of like I kind of always feel worried about doing that because you're doing that in a participation of electoralism, and it's like, I mean, electoralism can do some good, definitely. I'm not going to dispute that, but I question how effective like electoralism is. Anyway, so I'll continue. If you see some bulldozers about to wreck your house, you engage in direct action to directly intervene and try and stop them. Just like in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Arthur then just laid in front of the bulldozer. I mean, it's a bypass. You got to build a bypass. Direct action places moral consensus up against the official law. It is the expression of the individual's readiness to fight, to take control of his life. Their lives, but yeah, a bit of bickering there, but yeah, still be better. But anyway, and to try directly to act on the world that separates us, to take responsibility for one's actions. San Tres Bulletin. What is direct action? To take a homely example, if the butcher weighs a meat with his thumb on a scale, one may complain about it and tell him he's a bandit who's robbed the poor. And if he persists and one does nothing else, this is mere talk. One may call the Department of Weighs and Measures, and this is indirect action. Or one may talk failing, insisted on weighing one's own meat, brings along a scale to check the butcher's weight, takes one's business somewhere else, help open a cooperative store, etc. And these are direct action. David Graeber, Habits of Direct Action. These might be some like other things I might read later on if they're on the Anarchist Library. Direct action aims to achieve our goals through our own activities rather than through actions of the others. Hold on, just a second. I just kind of like forgot something. I want to like share or I want to link into one last space. Sorry about this. Just behind the scene things. I don't know. It was just like, oh wait, I want to like do this in one other space. And things are loading because I'm also running OBS. Okay, yeah, share function, share into group. And share there. Okay. Yeah. Oh! Might as well share there too. Should try to come on that group too. Alright, back to here, and back to all these places, and bam. Where was I? So direct action aims to achieve our goals through our own activities rather than through the actions of others. It's about people taking power from themselves. In this, it is distinguished from other forms of political actions such as voting, lobbying, attempting to exert political pressure through industrial actions or through the media. And yeah, I bet through the lobbying and attempt to exert political pressure and industrial action and the media, that's still kind of like a lot of activities that organizations like DSA or parts of the DSA or others kind of like organizations and political groups do try to do. I think we try to. I think that's what work in Washington, say Washington State Workers Advocacy Group that I'm a part of. That's what we try to do when our campaigns against the gig economy. We were trying to exert political pressure essentially, and through the media and through industry action. So yeah. And so maybe what I was doing wasn't direct action. I'm fine. I'm fine with that. All of these activities concede our power to existing institutions, which work to prevent us from acting in ourselves to change the status quo. Direct action repudiates such acceptance of existing order and suggests that we both the right and the power to change the world. It is demonstrated this by doing it. Examples of direct action includes blockades, pickets, sabotage, squatting, tree spiting, lockouts, occupations, rolling strikes, slowdowns, the revolution and the Revolutionary General Strike. I'll also say, since I'm on Twitch and TOS, that this is all in a video game. Let's see if the tea's ready to drink. Okay. In the community, it involves, against other things, establishing our own organizations such as food co-ops and community access and radio and TV. Direct action is not only a method of protest, but also a way of building the future now. Any situation where the people organize to exert control over their own circumstances without recourse to capital or state constitutions, any situation where people organize to exert control over their own circumstances without recourse to capital or to state constitutes direct action. Where it succeeds, direct action shows that people can control their own lives, in effect that an anarchist society is possible. Rob Spiro, Anarchist Politics and Direct Action. Yeah, essentially it's a lot of examples of just like various different things. So I think and these would be like actual works that had to like put a pen into it, save it, and like put it on a list or something like that of potential books that I should read, or potential works I should read. And if they're shorter essays, I might like randomly read it too. And they want to like diversify like the political stuff I'm doing. Like I have a bunch of articles that I like have bookmarked and are saved. So it's like, no, I want to read these. But anyway. Every person who ever thought he had a right to assert something and went boldly and inserted it, himself or jointly with others, that shared convictions was direct actionist. Every person who ever had a plan to do anything and went and did it, or who laid his plan before others and won their cooperation to do it with him, without going to external authorities to please do the thing for them, was a direct actionist. Every person who ever in his life had a difference with anyone to settle, and went straight to the other persons involved to settle it, either by a peaceful plan or otherwise, was a direct actionist. Voltaire, the I should know how to pronounce that because like I've seen this guy's like name about. I read some of his other works or like listened to like audible anarchist versions of his like essays, and he wrote that in Direct Action. Oh yes, Adam Goldman. I love Adam Goldman's work. Man has as liberty as he is willing to take. Anarchism therefore stands for direct action, the open defiance of and resistance to all laws and restrictions, economic, social, and moral, but defiance and resistance are illegal. Therein lies the salvation of man. Everything illegal necessitates integrity, self-reliance, and courage. In short, it calls for free, independent spirits, for men who are men, and who have a bone in their backs, and which you cannot pass through your hand through. Emma Goldman, Anarchism, what it stands for. Yeah, Emma Goldman's life is very interesting. It's really interesting to look up. A lot of her works are available in the Anarchist Library too. It should be easy to see why anarchists have always been drawn to the idea of direct action. Anarchists reject the states and all systematic forms of inequality states makes possible. They do not seek to pressure the government to institute reforms, neither do they seek to seize the state's powers for themselves. Rather, they wish to destroy that power, using means that are, so far as possible, consistent with their ends that embodies them. They wish to build a new society in the shell of the old. Direct action is perfectly consistent with this, because it is, in essence, a direct action in the insistence, when faced with structures of unjust authority, on acting as if one's already free. One does not solicitate aid the state. One does not even necessarily make a grand gesture of defiance. Insofar as one is capable, one proceeds as if the state does not exist. Yes, in a video game, this is how I would imagine that, anarchists should, go about and try to, and help out. And maybe they kind of, try to explain this also to, liberals as well. It's just act as if the government is not there, as it were. Yeah, the libertarians will, be excited by that, and they'll be they love that. I'm talking about the American libertarians, right-wing libertarians. But it's just but we are also anti-capitalist, so it was we also don't want to think of businesses or bosses being able to control you. But I think it's just hey, that's how I think we should carry ourselves. It's how would we live without the state, as it were? Or how would we live without all these systems of oppressions? Colonialism, imperialism, central colonialism, I should say, central patriarchy, white supremacy, ableism. How would we live like this and choose to live like that if we can? Yeah. And if we can't, well, how can we make it possible to live like that? So this is the difference in principle between direct action and civil disobedience, though in practice there is often a good deal of overlap between the two. When one burns a draft card, one is withdrawing one's consent or cooperation from a structure of authority one deems illegitimate, but doing so is still a form of protest. A public act addressed at least partially to the authorities themselves. Typically, one participating in civil disobedience is also willing to accept the legal consequences of his action. Direct action takes a matter a step further. Is accepting the legal consequences of his actions. That reminds me of how Extinction Rebellion in the UK actively encourages their participants to get arrested, and it just seems bizarre to me of that. But if they do good work, going on Extinction Rebellion, I have a comrade that actually has a video essay detailing his criticisms of Extinction Rebellion and of Extinction Rebellion UK. Extinction Rebellion in other chapters in around the world might be actually badass and cool and very anarchistic, but Extinction Rebellion in the UK, from what I've seen, maybe they get attention, and I don't know. Anyway. Probably shouldn't shit too much on organizations. Direct action takes matters a step further. The direct actionist does not just refuse to pay taxes to support a militarized school system. She combines with others to try to create a new school system that operates on different principles. She participates as she would if the state does not exist, and leaves it to the state representatives to decide whether to try to send army men to stop her. Now, the reader might object. Surely, direct action does usually involve direct confrontation with representatives of the state. even when it does not start with such confrontation, everyone is quite aware it will be probably lead to one eventually. Certainly. This is I have advocated for a violent revolution in a video game in the past before, and something as a tactic that is not really useful at all. However, I am not against there being violent revolution in a video game, in that even if we have a non-violent revolution of some kind in a video game, the state will react to us violently. They will try to suppress us, and that's is what is illustrated here. Which is why even we want to try to have a peaceful revolution as much as possible in a video game, there's going to be at least some violence, and we'll have to protect ourselves from state violence. That's where that would certainly seem to imply recognition of their existence. True enough, but even here matters are more subtle. When confrontation occurs, it is typically because those conducting a direct action insist on acting as if state representatives have no more rights to impose their views of the rights or wrongs of the situation than anybody else. If a man is driving a truck full of toxic waste to dump in a local river, the direct actionist does not consider whether the corporation he represents is legally permitted to do so. He treats him as he would anyone else trying to dump a vat of poison into the local water source. By misunderstanding the fact that, like said, direct actionist rarely simply attempts to physically overpower the culprit is remarkable testimony to most activists' dedications to nonviolence. Yeah. No. Captain Planet will not be nonviolent about that. Captain Planet also has superpowers and it's a cartoon, yes, but no, Captain Planet would wouldn't politely ask, "Could you please stop dumping the toxic waste vats in the local river supply?" No, he would more focus on cleaning up the river though, instead of using violence against the culprits. But he will also just apprehend them and restrain them as well. Normally, the conclusion is that that is legitimate for any man or woman or of consensus in the vicinity to band together to try to dissuade the would-be dumper, and if necessary stop him, say by laying down in front of the truck or by puncturing its tires. Sabotage. In a video game. If they do so, and 20 armed men in blue costumes That's what should we call the police officers from now on. Men in blue costumes. Women in blue costumes. Then appear and tell them to clear the streets. They do not. In turn, treat this demand as a legal order, but rather as a moral equivalent to any demand that a group of men standing on the streets might make. Therefore, if police demand that those blocking the trunk clear the street because an ambulance is trying to get through, they will almost certainly comply. And we have seen that a lot, that in recent BLM protests, protests against police brutality, that a lot of this is a right-wing scare tactic. It's oh, they're blocking the highways, why did the ambulance get through? No, the BLMs will park ways and let the ambulance through. It's been the Trump supporters like Proud Boys or other far-right groups that when they're protesting, they block the ambulances. From what I've seen. If police make such demands simply by dint of legal authority as representatives of the city, blockaders will ignore them. If they're threatened to attack, blockaders will consider whether they are willing to take the risk involved in making a stand. And we got a little note here. Does that work to go all the way to the notes page? Yes. Obviously, in real direct action situations, such questions are usually worked out in advance by affinity groups. Still, in each case, what levels of risk one is willing to undergo should always be an individual decision. I mean, if I can speak personally, I have thought about that. If I join the protests against police brutality, which I am 100% philosophically in agreement with, I say abolish the police. It'll be a long process, but I say abolish the police. But I thought it's what if I get arrested? The only concern is if I would miss a day of work, or if I would lose my job, which I don't think I will lose my job. Depends on how long I'm in jail. But my concern with losing my job is not only for like my ability to like pay rent and buy food and all those other things, but it's more concerned of like how if I'm don't have a job or in jail, it would be difficult for me to actually financially support a lot of my friends that I actually do, much to my detriment of my credit score. But I do actually give a lot of money that I make away to people, and so that's my only concern of like keeping my job as it is and avoiding arrest as much as possible. Not that because I'm afraid of having a criminal record and that will affect my employment and stuff like that, but because I won't be able to like have the ability to financially assist my friends who are just struggling to survive. So the key point is though that one is still acting as if it is at least a moral an entity. The state does not exist. Another note here to explain that. Didn't go directly to the note, but like close enough. One might say in Austrasianism, I'm confident that's how to say it. Terms that direct action involves a systematic refusal of interpolation. And if one takes his moral view systematically, it's hard to see the police as anything but a heavily armed and extremely dangerous street gang, which is precisely the way anarchists often refer to them. Yep. At any rate, it would be possible to have a secret direct action. It is, by definition, impossible to conduct a secret act of civil disobedience. What I have been developing here is what might be called the classic definition of direct action. One developed and elaborated over at least a century and a half of anarchist reflection. Often nowadays, the term is used in a much looser sense. Direct action becomes any forms of political resistance that is overt, militant, and confrontational, but that falls short of outright military insertion, e.g. Carter in 1973. In this sense, if one is doing more than marching around with signs, but not yet ready to take on the hill with AK-47s, then one is a direct actionist. The Boston Tea Party, during which a team of colonial revolutionaries dressed as Indians dumped loads of heavily taxed British tea in the Boston Harbor, is often invoked as a classic example of direct action of this sort. I'm drinking tea right now. Indeed, one popular game amongst contemporary activists is to imagine how an event like the Boston Tea Party would be reported by the American media if it had occurred today. The dressing up as like the indigenous people, well, to be fair to colonists, like did a whole bunch of like worse things to the indigenous people than just dressing up of them. But that kind of shows of like being a jackass and like in dressing up as someone else's culture as form of costumes has been like a staple of like white America since the colonial days. And also with the terrible treatment that we do to indigenous people in the Americas, or when this country is founded. At this date of me recording this on the 21st of November, we're coming up to that day of Thanksgiving, which will be 26th this year, of where we celebrate what we did to indigenous people in the most whitewashed, like a gentle way of reminding us of like how good it was when the Pilgrims were terrible house guests to the land and to the indigenous people. I really want to know about like the real first Thanksgiving and how that really was. I don't know. Maybe that's covered in Howard Zim's The People's Universe of the United States, which actually is on the Anarchist Library, if I remember correctly. It'd be fun to actually read. No, it wouldn't be fun. It would be interesting to read those chapters. Anyway. Such actions tend to be militant and symbolic at the same time. Used this way, the term direct action can cover an enormous range. It can mean action from insistence on one's rights to sit at a segregated lunch counter or setting fire to one, from placing oneself in the way of bulldozers in the old-grown forest to spiking in trees so that loggers who disregard warnings did not cut in certain areas and risk killing themselves. Wow. Activists, too, will often talk as if the difference between direct action and civil disobedience is simply one of militancy. For some, it turns on willingness to accept arrest. Those carrying out a CD, a civil disobedience, may willingly surrender themselves to the police, even if they don't. When they blockade the entrance to a corporate headquarters or lie down in front of the presidential motorcade, they act in full expectation that they will wind up in jail. And when police indeed intend on arresting them appear, they will not flee and will resist only passively or not at all. Direct actionists, in contrast, whether they are breaking windows in the night or shouldering in the doors shut in workers operated factories, are trying their best to get away with it. Or alternatively, the distinction may turn on how closely one tactics come into confrontation and conventional definition of violence. When English suffragists refuse to pay taxes, they are usually described as participating in civil disobedience. When they begin systematically breaking store windows, they are usually said to have turned to direct action. Of course, by classic anarchist definition, smashing windows to pressure the government to enact a voting reform is not direct action in any sense at all. It is thoroughly indirect. But the usage demonstrates of how much the term has become synonymous with a certain degree of militancy. I fall for that as too. Yeah, I mean, I kind of reflected on it at the beginning of the chapter, where it's just oh wait, pressuring the government institutions and pressuring media, pressuring industry, pressuring those people, pressuring them to do the right thing as opposed to doing it yourself, whatever that means, is not in of itself direct action. And it's oh, so it's wait a minute, when have I participated in direct action? Now that I think about it, maybe it'd be something like giving someone some food. If a homeless person is hungry and needs food, or they say that they want food, and then giving them food would be direct action, as opposed to going to the city council members and saying, hey, there are homeless people that are starving, we should do something about that. And then the city council finally, after means testing or doing a study, determined, yes, it's probably be a good idea to give homeless people some food, and so they finally give them some food. That would be indirect action. But opening a soup kitchen, that would be direct action. So all of these makes it easy to see why the question of direct action has been so often at the center of political debate. During the first half of the 20th century, for example, there were endless arguments about the role of direct action in the labor movement. Today, it is easy to forget that when labor unions first appeared, they were seen as extremely radical organizations. They represent, in fact, a kind of calm of revolutionary dual power. To go on strike, to destroy machinery, occupy factories, establish picket lines, so as to physically prevent scabs from entering a workplace. All of this was a matter of workers seizing for themselves the right to employ coercive force, in direct defiance of the state's claim of holding a monopoly on violence. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, one of the earliest 19th century anarchist philosophers, and closely attached to the French labor movement of his day, actually opposed strikes because he believed the movement should limit itself only to explicitly non-violent forms of direct action. Very quickly, though, states could not have completely repressed unions and set out to co-opt them. Certain forms of industrial action, such as picket lines, were legally and by strictly regulated others, such as workplace sabotage, strictly forbidden. As one might imagine, all of this sparked lively debate within the secularist movement. George Sorel captures something of the favor of this debates in his essays Reflections on Violence, published in France in 1908. In it, he argued that even when a strike or a labor action really does challenge the state monopolies on violence, even if one is dealing with a illegal wildcat strike, strikes are not really revolutionary because ordinarily a strike aims to win concessions on wages, hours, or conditions that the state will then guarantee and ultimately enforce. I kind of I thought of strikes, even wildcat strikes, as being a form of direct action. And I'm reflecting on what direct action is for myself. One is therefore not challenging state violence, but trying to elicit informs for one's own side. Sorrells argued that, like an anarchist point of view, the only genuine revolutionary strike would be a general strike that aimed to overthrow the system of state violence as a whole. I mean, there's been calls for it and a lot of calls for it recently, and the only problem is we have to ensure that people are fed and people receive food during this whole strike. Which actually I think is the thesis of the Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Is the revolution needs bread. Labor actions, therefore, were legitimate only insofar as they were attempts to move in that direction. Dress rehearsals, perhaps, or forms of agitprop. I do a lot of agitprop. It's to the annoyance of some liberals, honestly. In the United States, too, political differences often end up being fought out largely through arguments about tactics. Actually, diary portions of the book and chapter 3, I think there's been we kind of saw a glimpse of no, there's often arguments even after these spokes councils, these spokes of the diversity of tactics, and there'll be a lot of people arguing against civil disobedience or arguing against violent tactics as well, or red bloc or black bloc kind of thing. The early part of the 20th century saw a profound split between mainstream unions like Knights of Labor, which eventually came to form the backbone of the AFL/CIO, and the revolutionary unions like the IWW, International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. I'm a member of the Wobblies. The later ultimately aim was the abolition of the wage system and their refusal to work through the state, which they saw as an illegitimate institution. They were, in essence, if not official, anarcho-syndicalists. Yeah, that's why I am a anarcho-syndicalist. Where mainstream unions emphasized higher wages and job security, the Wobblies were like European activist unions and more interested in reducing hours. Still, the main thing they ended up openly arguing about was the Wobbly endorsements of direct action. I feel like the need to sneeze, so hold on. It's a good thing I have a mute button on my microphone. Hopefully I can mute it in time as I sneeze. Which in this context became, hey Naz, this context basically came to mean workplace sabotage. I hope you're feeling well, Naz. It's important to emphasize here that the practice of workplace sabotage was never considered particularly scandalous, at least. I know that feeling. I've only been up for 4 hours, and so at least amongst workers. The destruction of the corporate property, workplace occupation, international shabby work, slowdowns, all of these have a long form part of the repertoire, the standard toolkit, one might say, of organized labor for centuries. They remain so this day. I grew up in the building in Manhattan with like faulty plumbing because workplace sabotage tracing back to like some labor dispute from the late 1950s. American strikers still regularly puncture tires and even set company equipment on fire. However, none of this is official union policy. Union officials invariably condone such actions, or else they denied they occurred. Part of the reasons is that they are allowed to strike. Unions are, paradoxically, the only organizations in the U.S. legally permitted to engage in direct action, but they can do so only if they do not call it that, and only at the cost of accepting endless and indignant indicated regulations, incendiary, intricate. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Regulations over how and when they can strike. What kinds of pickets they can set up and where, whether they are allowed to engage in other tactics such as secondary boycotts or even publicly campaigns, and so on. Anything that goes beyond these regulations tend to be defined as direct action, and officials disallow. This is the reason, as we will see, the union leaders invariably do everything in their power to ensure that rank-and-file workers do not participate in direct actions like those in Seattle and Quebec City. Yep, we all know about the WTO riots in 1999 in Seattle and Quebec City. We just read about in the first 4 chapters of this book, the diary portion. If union members, in their capacity as union members, have helped pull down the wall in Quebec, for example, they would not just be engaging in illegal activities, they would have been jeopardizing the very basis of their leadership special arrangement with the state. Learning about direct action, the theory part of it. And I got my hot water leaf juice drink here, just normal black tea. Those continuing to work within the syndicalist tradition will unsurprisingly object to the sort of identification of direct action with mere militancy. They tend to prefer definitions like those which I began with the chapter. A few gone so far as to argue that large-scale actions like Seattle, Quebec were not really direct action at all, just for this reason. Shortly after the shutdown of the World Trade Organization in Seattle in November 1999, for example, a Norwegian anarcho-syndicalist named Harald Bjerre Arnesen wrote an article intending to show that Seattle wasn't really direct action because it did not involve people acting directly to transform their own immediate situation. Campaigning for wage workers to join the industrial workers of the world, Eugene V. Debs stated in December 1905, the capitalist owns the tools they do not use. The workers use the tools they do not own. To this one could add, at times direct action may mean putting the tools who do not own out of action. At times it may mean bringing them into play for our own self-defined needs and ends. In the final instance, it can only mean acting as if all the tools were in fact our own. Bjerre Arnesen, 2011. Once again, direct action means insisting on acting as if it is already free. This is why he goes on to argue it lies at the heart of the anarchist social revolutionary project. It is the means by which the working class can immaculate themselves by their own efforts rather than the guidance of any sort of revolutionary vanguard or elite. From this perspective, we can define direct action as being an action carried out on the behalf of nobody else but ourselves, where the means are so indefinitely also the ends, and if not, as it is a wage strike, not mandated by any union bureaucracy, where the means decreasing the boss's profits by our own non-work and thus also diminishing the boss's power, stands in an immediate relationship to a self-defined ends, increasing our wages and extending our own power. Direct action successfully carries out brings about a direct rearrangement of existing conditions of life through the combined efforts of those directly affected. That's the same quote. I will take this moment that because I'm just so used to doing so, and because I love to, even if like the only 3 viewers, no, 2 viewers is me and Naz. I will shout out Naz the Neko, because also this gets put up onto my YouTube channel, so that way people can like see that in the chat box, and it's like, oh, maybe I'll check out Naz the Neko. And I hope that things are, I hope like waking up is like as comfortable for you as possible, Naz. And I don't mind if anyone lurks as well. What happened at Seattle? A group of activists tried, and for a while succeeded, in shutting down a meeting of trade bureaucrats so as to disrupt negotiations on a new WTO round, and to make a public issue out of the very existence of the World Trade Organization. This, Beer Hansen is willing to allow, does in certain ways resemble direct action. Certainly, those who call the Direct Action Network, which is referred to as DAN in the diary chapters, to coordinate the proceedings, believe that what they were doing, to coordinate the proceedings, believe that's what they were doing. They were doing direct action. If one simply applies the citation of militarism, one might be tempted to agree, but the event did involve a prolonged, if non-violent, confrontation with the police. But in fact, Bjorn insists it was not really direct action because it was not really direct. He provides an example. Imagine a town that suffers from a lack of water. What's more, some real estate owns all the surrounding lands and has the mayor in his pockets, so townsfolk cannot simply build a new well. If one were to assemble a group of townspeople to dig a new well anyway, in defiance of the law, then that would be direct action. But if one were to have them blockade the mayor's house until he changes his policy, that would certainly not be. It might be far more militant than writing petitions or letters or lobbying, but it's just another version of the same thing, an appeal to the powers that be to change their behavior. It still recognizes that the authorities of real direct actionists would reject. B.R. and Sanders concludes that the efforts to shut down the WTO meetings in Seattle was not an example of direct action because ultimately it was simply an attempt to create a media spectacle that would then influence the powers that be by way of some imagined public opinion. From 2012. The WTO meetings themselves were, after all, basically ceremonial. Most real decisions are made elsewhere. Therefore, the real purpose of the protest was to provide a kind of counter-ceremony aimed at winning public attention, since its essentially aims to shut down the WTO as an institution could not possibly be accomplished by the means employed. It was essentially an act of propaganda, of guerrilla theater, meant to influence government policies. Baron Hansen ends the piece by admitting that any direct action is, to a certain degree, an act of propaganda by the deed, since they meant to teach through example. The community that defines the laws by building its own will is not simply acting for themselves. They are also setting an example of self-organizations of communities, and this is a secondary effect. Otherwise, direct action, and anyway, they are not trying to influence the government. Yeah. Now, trying to remember back of how the media covered the WTO rights in like 1999. I was finishing up middle school. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, no, right. Did I start high school then? Well, it was either 9th grade or 10th grade at the time. And I think it definitely got attention that like a lot of people were upset the WTO being there, essentially. And I'm not sure how well it was it was kind of effective at drawing attention, as it were. So yeah, that's interesting. Um, so yeah, it's kind of like wondering in if it was is effective than what they were trying to do, because otherwise, yeah, this kind of was just like the propaganda of the deed by the deed, which anarchist Mikhail Bakunin thought would be quite effective. And at the time, yeah, because not a lot of people could actually read, so they couldn't read theory, and they thought that like people could be like radicalized by like such deeds as like attempted assassinations, as were. But yeah. I was like here. The community that defines the law by building its own will is not simply acting for themselves. There are also setting an example of self-organization to other communities. But this is a secondary effect of a otherwise direct action. And anyway, they are not trying to influence the government. Now, I'm citing this argument at such lengths because I found it particularly persuasive. It represents the opinions of one older, rather curmudgeon anarcho-syndicalist, and I believe that the overwhelming majority of the contemporary anarchists would certainly disagree with his conclusions. After all, as Soros points out, one could apply the same logic to the very labor actions B.R. Anson approves of, since ultimately strikers are seeking binding arbitrations by government mediators, and even if they are not, any agreement that they make with their employers will end up being enforced by the state. If one takes Bjorn Anson's line of argument to its logical conclusion, no action that occurs under a framework of legality or in which public opinion is a factor could possibly be considered direct. After all, if one placed one's body in the path of bulldozers are about to destroy one's home or a community garden, much through though one might like to think of what one is doing is simply appealing to the moral consensus of the driver, one cannot realistically deny that the driver is also likely to be thinking about the possibilities of being brought up on charges of negligent homicide, or being written up in the papers the next day as a heartless killer. Bjorn Anson himself is not entirely unaware of this dilemma. At least in the case of strikes, he ends his essay by suggesting that certain strikes are actually better examples of direct action than others. His favorite examples is a strike by transit workers in Melbourne during the 1980s, in which rather than walking off their jobs, bus drivers and train conductors stayed on, but stopped collecting fares, effectively making mass transit free until the action was over. Imagine, he suggests, that what what would happen if, just one day, workers in every branch of industry and service trade did the same. This alone could be a major step in showing how a capitalist economy could be transformed into an economy of freedom. I actually suggest this to people. Just try to imagine, and because a lot of people when they try to do like hear anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism, either you mentioned communism where they'll like have their images of what they see as like communism, and if they fell for the Red Scare propaganda, then they'll reject it. Or if they fell for propaganda from the right wing, they'll reject it outright too, because why you want to be like Venezuela, that sort of thing. As I mentioned, but others even like that don't necessarily agree with or buy with that kind of propaganda, or they do recognize it as well. They still have a hard time imagining what a anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist world or anarcho-communist world would be like. And they just imagine it's so widely different than the world that they have now that they see it like pie in the sky, kind of like fantasizing. And I have actually dealt with that too. I got that like complaint and thrown back at me, but how I imagine the anarcho-syndicalist world, the anarcho-communist world, within the framework of the world we have now. I imagine it's just like the world we have now, except, oh, rent, there's no such thing as it. You don't have to pay that. You can either choose to live here, or hey, there's a vacancy here. You can choose to live there. You can choose to move to different places. You get on the bus, there's no charge. You get on the train, there's no charge. You go to the grocery store. It's not, you don't buy the things because there's no prices on those things. You just pick and choose what you need, and everyone most everyone that works there continues to work there because they love providing the service of like, oh, you need this, oh, you need this, oh, you need this, or it's like, or stocking the shelves, working on the farms, growing the foods. The farmers don't sell their food; they give the food that they produce, well, keeping what they need for themselves, of course, and like maybe in a stockpile. But like everyone knows that. If you ordered something off the internet of shopping, instead of like the price of what it is, they will just like say we currently have this many on order, more is being made, or like in the price of like when you can like get it, you'll pay more to get it the next day. You're just like, I select it and it'll be delivered in within this number of days. Imagine that world like that. I tried to like, I presented that to one of my coworkers, and they're like, yeah, so how would we value things? Which is interesting that he immediately went to that. Well, he's kind of a manager, so it's kind of like his job is kind of like working with those numbers, especially for like customers, it's customer service. But then just thinking that, wow, if their things did not have prices, we would be like valuing things differently. And how would we value things then if we are valuing things so differently? But yeah, so that's why I'm thinking something like, yes, have an economy of freedom. And people ask, well, how does it work? And it's just like, well, haven't you like given things to your friends or family members? And or they're in need of something, so you give them something that they're in need of. It's just like it's another way to imagine things, but people seem to like find it so hard to imagine, or they like buy it in like propaganda of like human nature, we're all naturally greedy, that they can't imagine that like that's kind of society just functioning or working. Mm. Anyway, I'll continue. This is a powerful image, but it bears a remarkable resemblance to the acts that Pierre Anson would no doubt condemn as pure theater. Take, for example, a public stunt organized by members of a squatting community in Christensen, located on the site of a former army base outside Copenhagen. In 1974, the community engaged in various forms of street theater to gain a more favorable public image. The first Christmas of the Poor and Lonely was arranged, uh, and Solengard organized a army of Father Christmases who generously handed out presents to both young and old from the city's department stores. Naturally, they were arrested as a consequence of pictures of police, but as consequences, pictures of police beating the Father Christmases hit the front page of the paper worldwide. And can I? No, I can't. Well, there's that web page for you to like click on it. So I'll type it into the chat right now. Let's see if it does bring up something. Nope, can't be reached. Okay. Yeah, damn it. Because if it did bring up something, I'll be like, I'll want to see. Uh, Clicking back over here, back over here, back over here. All right. The 12. Yeah. But trying to imagine like that the police officers just beating up a bunch of Father Christmases, kind of clever, honestly. In other words, they made almost the same point as the Melbourne strikers, but with hardly any real direct action at all. So then the question becomes, where's the line drawn? How direct does it have to be? If providing free goods and services to 4 or 5 random kids on the street is not enough to make it real, why should tens of thousands of commuters for one day be any different? The reason I cite this argument at length is that it provides a window on a moral universe. Most American anarchists I know find the arguments about whether Seattle was really a direct action a bit silly. At best, they might make a mildly diverting topic for discussion over beer, but to take such questions too seriously seems academic, even sectarian. Still, the underlying issues are critical, as we'll see. Most of the objections raised to the idea of broader actions in the weeks before Quebec City were based on the feelings of such actions would merely be symbolic and not general direct action. Moreover, the essence of the beer answers the critique that actions like Seattle are largely symbolic, and that the point is to work within communities in ways that allow people to take powers over their own lives, is something anyone included in the movement would agree with. Even before Naomi Klein, 2000, wrote her famous article in The Nations warning activists about the dangers of summit hopping and following trade bureaucrats as if they were the Grateful Dead. All of these was already a major item of debate. Those who defend actions like Seattle not only insisted that it was a direct intervention, since people put their bodies on the line as to block delegates from entering the building, but that they did so in just the way that Beer Anson's analyzed as key, by mobilizing a community of people in a form of self-organization which provides a living alternative to the existing structure of authority. This was indeed meant as educational. On the one hand, they set out to expose the undemocratic nature of the WTO, similar institutions that they felt together formed the backbone of an unaccountable world neoliberal government that sought the power to suppress existing democratic rights in the name of corporate power. On the other hand, they were determined to organize the whole action according to directly democratic principles and thus provide a living example of how genuine egalitarian decision-making might work. When dealing with global institutions, this is about as direct as an action can possibly get. The Direct Action Network, which forms much of the immediate focus of this book, emerged directly from this project. It was meant in part as a way of organizing actions against neoliberal institutions, in part as a model of consensus-based decentralized direct democracy. For all of its flaws, and we will be learning a good deal about those, it played an important role in doing so. To sum up, then, direct action represents a certain ideal, in its purest forms, probably unattainable. It is a form of action in which means and ends become effectively indistinguishable, a way of actively engaging with the world to bring about change, in which forms of the action, or at least the organization of the action, is itself a model for the change one wishes to bring about. And it is, as its most basic, it reflects a very simple anarchist ideal, that one cannot create a free society through military discipline, a democratic society by giving orders, or a happy one through joyous self-sacrifice. At its most elaborate, the structures of one's own act becomes a kind of micro-utopia, a concerned model for one's visions of a free society. As Goldman and others observe, the fact that the authorities define such acts as crimes is not a problem in this regard, insofar as it serves constantly remind actors to take responsibility for their actions and behave with courage and integrity. It can be great advantage. The problem, rather, comes when one moves beyond confrontation to other forms of engagement with a world organized as all different lines. A revolutionary strategy based on direct action can only succeed if the principles of direct action become institutionalized. Temporary bottles of autonomy must gradually turn into permanent free communities. However, in order to do so, those communities cannot exist in a total isolation. Neither can they have a purely confrontational relationship with everyone around them. They have to have some way to engage with larger economic, social, political systems that surround them. This is the trickiest question because has proved extremely difficult for those organized on radical democratic lines to integrate themselves in any meaningful way in large structures without having to make endless compromises in their founding principles. For direct action based groups, even working in alliance with radical NGOs or labor unions, those who don't know, NGOs, non-government organizations, has often created what seems like insurmountable problems. Insurmountable. Insuperable. Insuperable. On a more immediate level, the strategy depends on the dissemination of the model. Most anarchists, for example, do not see themselves as vanguards, whose historical roles is to organize other communities, but rather as one community setting an example others can intimidate. It's all because, and this is a lot of anarchists or a lot of people want that. A lot of liberals or a lot of many people who are just unsure of anarchism, unsure of that sort of thing, want to see know what's the bridge, or how do we get from here, shaped in liberal capitalism, to anarchism, or to anarcho-communism, or anarcho-syndicalism. How do we get from here to there? They're really concerned about that. And the thing is, I have to tell people, well, listen, as an anarchist, I cannot just say this is the plan. Because if I set out here's the blueprint, or here's the plan, or here's how we move from here to there exactly, that would be more of being Marxist-Leninist. That would be more of being authoritarian leftist, authoritarian socialist. That's more of here's how the government should work. And anarchists don't believe in governments as an institution. We are still for governance, but you can have governance without governments. So, as anarchists would not would not try to organize other communities. They would organize their own community, or work in their own community, or be a community themselves to set the precedent and have others follow. That's how we to proceed, as it were. The approach, it's often referred to as Contaminationism is premised on the assumption that the existence of freedom is suspicious, and that anyone who takes part in direct action is likely to be permanently transformed by the experience once more. That is often the case, but it begs the question of how to make others aware of the idea in the first place. What participants experience as profound and transformed as others often look. From the outside, as particular at best, at worst, a cult-like or insane. This, in turn, raises the issue of the media. But in addressing such strategic questions, I am really moving from speaking just of direct action to more generally questions of anarchism. Dun dun dun. What is anarchism? But I'm now out of my hot water leaf juice, and I'm going to like make some more, and this would be a good opportunity to like also take a self-care break and use the facilities, and so for it's good to a chance to like take a break. I've been streaming for an hour, so anyone that's like watching, if you need to, take a break and check to see, have you taken your meds yet? If you have meds, have you gotten something to drink? Have you gotten something to eat? Have you use the facilities if you need to? Do all that. Stand up, stretch, as it were. If you're watching the YouTube portion of this as I upload it there, then you can do the same. I'll probably will edit out the like break from the initial broadcast, but you can still pause the video and then take a break yourself. It probably will have a little message there to remind you of that too, because I'm going for an hour, and we're only 11 pages in this chapter 5, Direct Action Ethnography. But for now, I'll go and transition over to the Be Right Back screen, and we will be right back in a few. It's a good opportunity to take a break. All right. All right. Settling back down. Transition back over. How's everyone doing? Hope everyone's doing okay. We're now into another fun part of the book of Direct Action Ethnography by David Graeber. What is anarchism? I mean, I have my simple ways of like how to like say what is anarchism, but I am kind of curious and fascinated by like how David Graeber goes on and talk about it. So now we are on to another fine thing. And besides, it's like sometimes when writing these books, it's kind of like helpful to like define, hey, this is anarchism, as it were. Because there are some people who probably like don't know what an anarchism is, and even though like I have my short definition of anarchism, basically rejection of like coercive unjustifiable hierarchies for the most part, but there are kind of like other but you can like describe it further or elaborate on it. And since this is a book, it's good to like elaborate on this sort of thing of what is anarchism. Because maybe this long form is a way to like convince people of like, no, anarchism is a good thing, or like you might be an anarchist. But yeah, I was going to continue part 2 essentially. What is anarchism? One reason I started this chapter as I did was because I'm also want to convey something of the flavor of anarchist debate, which has always tended to differ from like the more familiar Marxist style and focusing more on these kinds of critique questions of practice. Many have complained that anarchism lacks high theory, even those who are considered its founding figures, Godwin, Proudhon, Bakunin, Prokopkin, often seem more pamphleteers and moralists than true philosophers. I beg to differ, but David Graeber is not agreeing that like these are just pamphleteers. He's saying that like these people are considered pamphleteers, and the best known anarchists of more recent times have been more likely to produce witty slogans, wild, pure. Poetic rants or science fiction novels than sophisticated political economy or dialectical analysis. Let's go to the notes. Next page over. 13. In fact, anarchists have long taken much of their political economy from Marxists. Yeah, very true. So even if a friend later on would say that like theory is unrelative, theory is unimportant, like who needs theory as it were, it mainly because like she doesn't have the energy or the spoons to read something like a textbook like this or like any kind of theatrical work, but yet even though she just hates Marx or hates Marxism, she has a reason for like the lumpen proletariat being like an ableist. No, any socialist, communist, or anarchists, even if they don't say that they are Marxists, and many anarchists actually don't, they do kind of derive their political economy from Marxism. From Marxists, a tradition which goes back to Bakunin, who thought he was a political rival of Marx, and always was responsible for the first translation of and also was responsible for the first translation of Capital into Russian, and rather than feeling obligated to set up anarchist schools of political economy of their own. Though, to be fair, early anarchists also tend to point out that almost all of the concepts attributed to Marx, or for that matter Proudhon, were really developed within the workers' movement at the time, and merely systematized and elaborated by the theorists. And remember, people, Proudhon predated Marx. And Proudhon, in What is Property, did say, I am an anarchist. So anarchism has, in fact, predated Marxism. And back to here. There are thousands of Marxist academics and very few anarchist ones. This is not because anarchism is anti-intellectual, so much as it's because it does not see itself as fundamentally a project of analysis. It is more of a moral project. As I've written elsewhere, Graeber 2002 and 2004, I think that's referring to fragments of the. Oh, hold on, I want to pull it up, actually. I'll get the anarchist library, actually, up a little bit, and put the link into the live chat, because I think that I'm not sure how academics kind of do that numbering thing of the author's name and the time. Pull this. Yeah, a lot of the papers and works of David Graeber and books are now up on the Anarchist Library. I think he's referring to this work, or maybe there's an essay that David Graeber wrote in 2002, but in 2004 he wrote this short little book, Fragments of a Anarchist Anthropology, which I actually read and I thought was quite good. And there's the link to that book. And I think that's what David Graeber is referencing there. Yeah, so clicking back to all the places here, so you can check that out, or save it. Nope. Clicking on all the things and rearranging things. Pardon me. But as everyone says, as I've written elsewhere, Marxism has intended to be a theoretical or analytical discourse about revolutionary strategy. Anarchism as an ethical discourse about revolutionary practice. The basic principles of anarchism: self-organization, voluntary association, mutual aid, the oppression of all forms of coercive authorities, and essential moral and organizational. Admittedly, this flies in the face of a popular image of anarchists as bomb-throwing crazies opposed to all forms of organization. But if one examines how this representation came about, it tends to reinforce my point. The period of roughly 1875 to 1925 marked the peak of certain phases of anarchist organization. There were hundreds of anarchist unions, confederations, revolutionary leagues, and so on. There was a spurt towards the beginning of call for the assassination of heads of states, Anderson 2006. It was quite brief, and anarchist spokesmen and organized groups quickly withdrew support for this strategy as counterproductive. Nevertheless, following the decades saw a continuous stream of dramatic assassinations by people calling themselves anarchists. I am not aware of any actual assassin during this particular period who actually was a product of those anarchist organizations, much less were their actions planned or sponsored by them. Rather, they almost inevitably turned out to be isolated individuals with no more ongoing ties to anarchist life than the humor bomber. Yeah, the Unabomber's anarcho-criminalists, and like I bet a lot of anarchists at the time of the Tuskegee bombings are like, no, 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 we're not all of us are like the Unabomber. No, no, not all of us are criminalists. I don't agree with criminalists whatsoever. No, screw anarcho-criminalists. No, their ideology is ableist, and usually about us roughly equivalent. Hold on. And usually about a roughly equivalent hold on insanity. It was rather as if the existence of anarchism gives lone gunmen something to call themselves. Referring to like another note, referring to like something. Malatesta made this exact argument at the time. 1913. Ooh. I've read some Malatesta. I actually read some like Enrico Malatesta on my stream some weeks ago. 1913. What did he wrote then? The Tragic Bandits by Enrico Malatesta. That's maybe one of the things they wrote in 1913. Yeah. That's what comes up when I type Malatesta 1913. The Tragic Bandits. Here's the there is the anarchist library page of it. Let's include the PDF and now. I mean, I might actually like read it for a future for a future stream. Maybe, I don't know. I'm a bit conscious, or like at least want to make sure that I don't break TOS, and so have to like make sure of that. So we'll click on here. But the situation creates endless moral dilemmas for anarchist writers and lecturers like Peter Kropotkin or Emma Goldman. By what right could a anarchist denounce a individuals who kills a tyrant, no matter how disastrous the results for the larger movement? The whole issue was the subject of endless, intense moral debate, not only about whether such acts were or could ever be legitimate, but about whether it was legitimate for anarchists who did not feel such acts were wise or even legitimate to publicly condone them. It has always been these kinds of practices, moral questions, that has tended to stir anarchist passions. What is direct action? What kind of tactics are beyond the pale? What sort of solidarity do we owe those who employ them? Or what is the most democratic way to conduct a meeting? At what point does organization stop being empowering and become stifling and bureaucratic? For analysis of the nature of the commodity form of the mechanics of alienation, most have been content to draw on the writings of written works of Marxist intellects, which are usually themselves drawn from the ideas that originally percolate through a broader workers' movement in which anarchists were very much involved. If there's a workers' movement, chances are there are anarchists that are involved. Which also means, especially historically, which also means that for all the bitter and often violent disagreements anarchists had with Marxists about how to go about making a revolution, there's always been a kind of complementary here, at least in potentia. Let's check this note 15. If existing Marxists were to abandon practical politics entirely and retreat into the academia, producing endless volumes of Marxist analysis on every topic under the sun and overwhelming all other intellectual tendencies, then most anarchists would consider this a altogether positive development. Aren't there a few academic anarchists around? I got a new little cup of like a hot water leech juice. This time it's peppermint. I think I still prefer black tea as opposed to like herbal teas, but like I don't know, the right kind of herbal tea would be like good. And hey, if this soothes my throat as well, then I'm all for it. This is why I think it is deceptive to write the history of anarchism in the same way one would write the history of intellectual tradition like Marxism. It's not that one cannot tell the story this way if one wants to. Most books on anarchism do. They start with like certain founding intellectual figures: Godwin, Stirner, Proudhon, Buchanan, Buckingham. Stirner is like his ideas are interesting, but it's just like some people think of Max Stirner as a knob. I mean, if you want to read The Ego in His Own, sure, I listened to the audiobook of it and it was interesting. I will say that. I'm not sure about Goldwyn though. Actually, I don't know if I ever read any of Goldwyn's work. Probably should look him up and like check out his ideas. If I do read something like Goldwyn, just like if I read Proudhon and Buchanan, it'll be like I'm reading old stuff, and like there is the argument to have is like, well, how relevant is this these old writings are compared to the modern day? It would be like for own one's interests, or for one's intellectual interests, if to wanted to read those kind of works, as it were, or even Stirner. I think I only recommend like reading Mark Stirner's like only if you're interested in it's how relevant would it be to like how relevant would it be to like modern day? That is debatable, but I would say even less so than like others. Anyway, they start with a certain talking about like many people who wrote history books of like anarchism. They start with like certain founding figures with certain founding intellectual figures, explain the radical ideas developed, tell the story of the larger movement that eventually came to be inspired by these ideas, and then document the political struggles, wars, revolutions, and projects of social reform which ensued, kind of like Catalonia in 1936. But if one looks at what those supposed founding figures actually said, one finds most of them did not really see themselves as creating some great new theory. They were more likely to see themselves as giving a name and voice to a certain kind of insurgent's common sense, one they assumed to be as old as history. While anarchism as a movement tend to be very strongly rooted in mass organization of the industrial proletariat, anarchists, including those who were themselves industrial workers, also tend to draw inspiration from existing modes of practice, notably on the part of peasants, skilled artisans, or even, to some degree, outlaws, hobos, vagabonds, and others who live by their wits. In other words, those who were to some degree in control of their own lives and conditions of work, who might can be considered, at least to some degree, autonomous elements. One might say, in Marxist terms, that they were people with such experiences of non-alienated productions. Such people had experience of life outside of the state or capitalist bureaucracies, salaries, and wage labor. They were aware of such relationships and were not infallible. Quite often, they viewed themselves as intrinsically immoral. They were often themselves more drawn to anarchism as an explicit political philosophy, and at least in sometimes in some places, Spanish peasants or Swiss witchmongers formed its own mass base. What more, these elements of industrial proletariat that tended to find the most affinity with anarchism were those who were at least removed from other modes of life. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that they find things intrinsically immoral. That's why I'm interested in reading Peter Kropotkin's life. He was a prince. He was aristocracy. He could have just like lived the easy life if he wanted to, but he actually renounced his princehood and just like wanted to be like a normal person. But he was an academic too. He studied like biology and animals and like sociology, and that's sort of like he had those like interests in those like field studies, which is why what drew him to write a collection of different like can't confirm being a normal person sucks. At least we have tea. But Kropotkin, well, that's one of the things actually for Kropotkin as well, is that like He when he did his science stuff, he got paid for that, as it were. There was his science his studies, is another thing, and this is actually quite good. This is peppermint. I'm not that big of a, like a mince as in general, but I like the seasonings of this peppermint tea. But when Peter Kropotkin would like wrote essays or various different things on anarchism, or he never got paid for that, and he wanted those like works to be like available to everyone for free. He never wanted royalties for that. For his science works, that makes sense. To like he had to like some compensations for that, and he like accepted that just be able to live and pay bills, of course. But for his anarchist works, yes. Yes, Peter Kropotkin, as I remember, denounced his princehood. He just abandoned it, abandoned his aristocracy, abandoned his title. He wanted to be with like the people, as it were, and he became a scientist, some kind, if I remember correctly, and so he wanted to be with the people. Yes, that is awesome. Yes, that's why and even though he's an old white guy as well, but that's why I wanted to like read up on him, and he did wrote a memoirs of his like life. It's a big book though, and there is some audio recording of it. The quality of it is like interesting, but it's available. His memoir is available on the Anarchist library as well. Just look up Peter Kropotkin and like memoirs like My Life or something like that, and you'll be able to find it. But yeah. But I digress. Let's see. Someone's made some found this based on with more of those elements of the industrial proletariat that tends to find more affinity with anarchists were those who were at least removed from like other modes of life. Marx himself tended to dismiss the anarchist base as particularly an incestuous combination of petty bourgeoisie and Laterano hates this word as ableist lumpen proletariat. And this is why Laterano would say screw Marx or fuck Marx, because like I thank you so much for the lumpen thing, and it's just like yeah, probably it's a concept we shouldn't like continue on. But anyway, it's historical and considered the notion that they could in any way stand outside of capitalist ridiculousness. Capitalism, for Marx, was a totalitarian system. It shaped the consensus of all those who live under it in the most intimate fashion. The kind of critiques of capitalism one saw in authors like Proudhon or Bakunin, Marx argued, were simply the voice of a petty bourgeoisie morality. The small-scale merchants and producers railing against the bigger ones. They had nothing to teach revolutionaries, only the industrial proletariat, who had absolutely no stake in the existing system, could be genuinely revolutionary class. Some would no doubt object to that this view of Marx thought it is a bit crude and unnuanced, and probably they'd be right. But it represents a view that soon became canonical amongst those who claimed to speak in the name of Marxism. My purpose here is not to argue that the merits of the case but to emphasize the degree to which we have been viewing the entire anarchist project, essentially, through the eyes of its rivals, even more that anarchism tends to be involved in a different relationship of theory and practice than what came to be called Marxism. The latter is, for all materialist pretensions, profoundly idealistic. The history of Marxism is presented to us as a history of great thinkers. They are Leninists, Maoists, Trotskyists, Gramscians, Austrians, even brutal dictators like Stalin and Ivan Holha had to pretend to be great philosophers because the idea was always that one starts with one's man's profound theoretical insight and the particular tendencies it follows from that. Yeah, even Lenin and Mao it did like some horrific stuff that I'm not going to apologize for. I haven't even read any of like Mao, Stalin, or like Lenin stuff. I would read some Lenin, maybe some Mao, like Green Book or something like that. Not sure if I ever going to read Stalin. I haven't even read all of like the anarchist work, and there's a lot that's also continuing. So it's just like, hey, if I continue to read like radical leftist like a theory, Stalin will be one of the last people I read. Dad and Dingus. So, it's tended to be great philosophers because the ideas was always the one that starts with one man's profound theoretical insight and political tendencies that follows from that. Anarchist tendencies, in contrast, never trace back to a single theorist's insights. We don't have predominantism and Croconites and associationalists, but socialists, individualists, syndicalists, and platformists. It's just about like every case. Divisions are based on a difference of organizational philosophy and revolutionary practice. How then do we think about a political movement in which the practice comes first and theory is essentially secondary? It strikes me that it might be helpful, rather than starting from the word anarchism, to start with the word anarchists. What sorts of people or ideas or institutions can this word refer to? Generally speaking, one finds three different ways the term can be employed. First, one can refer to people who endorse an explicit doctrine known as anarchism, or sometimes anarchy, or perhaps more precisely, a certain versions of human possibilities. This is more or less the conventional definition. Anarchists becomes the bearers of an intellectual tradition, one whose histories can indeed be traced back to founding figures in the 19th century. That spread quite rapidly by the turn of the century to the point where anarchist literature was being avidly read in places like China and India well before Marxism or other strains of Western revolutionary thought had been much more of an inspiration, e.g. Dunglet 1991 for the source, but over the course of the early 20th century was largely displaced by it. Mm-hmm. And go to note number 16. Even here things are a bit subtle. Many of the founding figures of anarchism were Russians. Tolstoy, Mikhail Bakunin, who did not really identify what they thought of as the West. But this is how the story is normally told. Let's see, and then back to 16. Oh yeah, that's another interesting thing. Is like, I had a thought. What was I about to say? Well, there's also there's essays that like explored like the anarchist ideas that were already existing in Taoism way back, like when and the Chinese kind of like developed that kind of like I think Taoism is a spiritual system or morality system. That's a word, and a lot of people have already seen connections of like anarchist ideas with Taoism and make the connections there. And plus, it's like what's about to say about this for thing? I had a thought, but no. I'll continue. Any number of prominent figures of the time, from Pascal to Mao, became their political lives as anarchists and ended up communists. But one can also speak more broadly. It's certainly not unheard of to hear historians refer to, say, peasants, rebels in early China, or religious radicals in the medieval Europe as anarchists, meaning that they reject the authority of governance and believe people would be better off in the world without hierarchies. In this sense, they have always been anarchists, and they have no great intellectual tradition that hasn't seen the development of anarchist ideas in one form or another. This is, of course, why the ideas of 19th century European anarchists could make sense to people in other parts of the world to begin with. Finally, there is the third sense. When an anthropologist like Evans Patris referred to the New World as living in ordered anarchy, 1940, or John Overling used the words to describe the Amazonian Puritans, 1986 and 88, they are not referring to either doctrine or even quite to anti-authoritarian rebelliousness. They're referring to primarily to institutions, habits, and practices. That is, there are certain societies characterized by egalitarian forms of organization, whether systems of exchange, forms of decision-making, or simply the accustomed ways of going about everyday life. This tends to be like inculcated and be supported by a broader egalitarian ethos. Anarchism, in sense, is a way of living, or at least a set of practices. This is part of why others are like mentioning that, like, you know what? When a lot of people are anthropologists and study like a lot of different cultures and how they organize some things, they kind of tend to become like anarchists in that way because like know what they see at work. David Graeber actually expressed this in himself that like he grew up with like an uncle who was actually part of the Revolutionary Army in Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War. So his uncle was with the Spanish anarchists at that time, the anarcho-syndicalists there, and so he was like fascinated by that sort of thing, but never really like he said that like, yeah, I'm an anarchist and I believe this is the way forward. He was just like, I want to study it, I want to learn more about it, I think it'd be kind of interesting. But he never thought it like, no, it could actually work and it could actually be possible until until he actually went out in the field as an anthropologist and went to Madagascar and saw that like, wait a minute, what? He was there for 6 months until he realized, wait a minute, there's no state here. Yeah, there's a police station like down their road, and you can go there and talk to that police officer stationed there. But he just like sits there all day and just like I'm just stationed here, but like nothing really happens, and so I don't have anything to do. And then he goes back to the people he was staying with in Madagascar, and they're just like, basically much the state just went left and leave the people alone, and the people just continuing to live in their society and organize things and how they do it, and they did so without a state. And of course, also the people there were like smart enough not to put up their own flags and say, "Ha, we are free, independent, like a nation of blah blah blah, or sovereignty of blah 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 blah." Because if they did, then it was like Madagascar would be like, "Nope, we still own you," and you come and destroy it. But they just like went about their normal business, and David Graeber never realized, like, wait, this is a society without a state. And everyone is, like, contributing to society to keep it functioning and keep it running. This is actually possible in modern day. Hey, and so that's when he got reaffirmed to be, like, I am an anarchist, and I believe that anarchism is just human nature. And that we can, like, they do that, and like the other things that like are opposed or the opposed against anarchism or against anarchism, it's not really human nature, and it's like stifling human creativity and human development and human flourishing. That's the word. So the state, white supremacy, cisgender patriarchy, ableism, colonialism, imperialism, all that sort of thing. Yeah, I'll continue. In other words, one can see anarchism either as a vision, as an attitude, or a set of practices. The distinction between the last two is admittedly somewhat fuzzy. Those who go on about their daily lives on an egalitarian basis tend to do so because they feel that is what people ought to do. Those who find all forms of hierarchies objectionable will ordinarily do their best to find ways to live without it. Still, in the first case, an egalitarian ethos may well largely remain. I don't know how to pronounce that word. I'm going to like actually open up a new browser. No. Hopefully that doesn't do anything. Actually, I could have like always done this. Well, that's open up. So new things. Yeah, because like, you can't like click on things and highlight the word. I lost my place now. Ah, there it is, right there. Okay, it's not in DuckDuckGo, but Webster Dictionary. What do you have for me?
Inchoate.
Inchoate. Being one partially in existence of operation. Inchoate. Ooh. Nice. Clicking on the various things now. And get them positioned how I want them to. And still, the first case is an egalitarian ethos might seem radically inchoate. In theory, at least one living in an anarchist society might be entirely unaware that there is in any way to live. Anyway, such a person will probably only develop explicit anti-authoritarian attitudes once she encounters someone with very different assumptions. Say, for example, a foreign conqueror. Yeah, look at the entire history of colonialism, imperialism. My friend Joey, the Indigenous Heretics, has said on Social Justice Achlemy that's think of all the problems of the world with such patriarchy, white supremacy, ableism, and all these sort of different things, and in the poverty, and and they kind of think when they trace back those kind of systematic issues, they kind of find it goes back to colonizers. Yeah. So then, one is not confrontational or anti-authoritarian until they are being confronted by a foreign conqueror. Similarly, those indignant about being pushed around by social superiors will often examine their own ways of dealing with friends and neighbors as evidence that hierarchy is not natural and inevitably features of human life. Inevitable features of human life. So many, I've been in arguments with people and they believe that hierarchies are always the thing and the hierarchies are natural, so you can never get rid of hierarchies. They believe that because their entire life has been under hierarchical systems, and so they cannot imagine and be in a world without hierarchies. That's why they kind of say hierarchies are naturals and hierarchies are inevitable, and there's always going to be people in hierarchies. And in subtle ways, a lot of people still believe that. The reason why some people are fine with rich people existing, as it were, are because they'll say, well, there's always going to be people that have more stuff than others. And it's so wait, there's always going to be people that there's always going to be wealth inequality, as it were, which is why these people would advocate more for taxing the rich, as I say, more or less to let's work to get rid of the rich, and I mean not get rid of the people themselves, but get rid of the systems that enriches them, so that they are rich people and when they're poor people. They might very well start evaluating the equality of those relations, or even try to deal with such people in more self-conscious egalitarian fashion than they had before. The 19th century Spanish peasants and Swiss wishwashers who found the ideas of Proudhon or Bakunin so amenable, and whose Marxist doctrines as petty bourgeoisie denounced, and who Marx denounced as petty bourgeoisie, were clearly doing exactly that. What I would like to argue is that anarchism is best thought of as not only as any of these things, not as a vision, but and neither quite as an attitude or a sense of principles. It is rather best thoughts as the very movement back and forth between these three. After all, the experience of foreign conquest or subordination will not necessarily cause once egalitarian communities to reject the very idea of hierarchy, or to become more salient. Okay, I don't know that word either. I'm going to look it up now. Where is it? Probably not in DuckDuckGo either. Oh wait, we have it here.
Assiduous.
Assiduous, showing or characterized by the persistent attention of or untrying application. Assiduous. Or to become more assiduously situacy egalitarian in their ways of dealing with each other. The effect might well be like exactly the opposite. It's when the three reinforce each other, when the revolution against oppression caused people to try to live their lives in more self-conscious egalitarian fashion, when they draw on their experiences, those experiences to produce visions of a more just society, when those visions in turn cause them to see existing social arrangements as even more illegitimate and obnoxious. And that one can begin to talk about anarchism. Hence, anarchism is in no sense a doctrine. It's a movement, a relationship, a process of purification, inspiration, and experiment. This is its very substance. All that really changed in the 19th century is that some people began to give its presence a name, this process a name. Looking at this way does make it much easier to understand some things that would otherwise be extremely puzzling. For example, why what passes as anarchist what passes as anarchist theories often bears so little in relations to what the majority of anarchists say and do. If one were to try to understand North American anarchism simply by reading theoretical or intellectual statements as best known and widely distributed explicitly anarchist periodicals, one would end up with the impression that most anarchists were either primitivists, screw those people, opposed to all forms of technology. We're reading Direct Action Ethnography by David Graeber. The first four chapters. This is kind of going over a bit like an overview and a history, and we're in a section where it is doing a long form answer of like what is anarchism. It's kind of like the theory portion of it, but I find David Graeber's writings much easier. It's Marxism. It covers. It kind of like it talks about Marx, but it doesn't explicitly cover Marxism. It's about anarchism. Marx gets brought up quite a bit. You're welcome. Primitives opposed to older forms of technology, even agriculture. It's kind of like it also is kind of like, since we're talking about like anarchism, is also kind of like trying to like address like a representation of anarchism from many different like ways, including from Marx himself, who kind of like denounced like anarchists like Proudhon and Bakunin as like petty bourgeoisie, as it were. But I'll continue. And the impression that most anarchists were either primitivists opposed to all forms of technology. And welcome, and Janice, India, for like coming in. I hope you enjoy your stay, and hope you enjoy the discussion and the reading of Direct Action Ethnography by David Graeber. We're in Chapter 5. What is anarchism? Even out culture or extreme anti-organizational. Suspicious of any group of more than 6 or 7 people. And the most of the remainder had declared their allegiance to a document called the Organizational Platform of the General Unions of Anarchists, written by Russian Milogists in Paris in 1924. One might also come to the conclusion that the popular impression of anarchists are wild-eyed and impractical nihilists dedicated to rebellion for its own sake, and was probably not that far from the truth. Or, at least, that anarchists seem to be divided between nihilists and the fervent sectarians, whose main form of political practice is mutual denunciation. Examining anarchist discussion pages on the internet would do little to disabuse them of this impression. It's almost like a joke or meme that like when you get a bunch of leftists together, even a bunch of anarchists together, they will just like do almost nothing but have arguments and disagreements. As this note 17 says, many anarchist news groups, for example, tend to dominate by right-wing free market enthusiasts who call themselves anarcho-capitalists. ANCRAPs. They call themselves ANCAPs for short, but no, they're ANCRAPs. Who seem to only exist online, at least. I've been involved in anarchist politics for 5 or 6 years now, and have yet to actually meet one. I have met a ANCRAP, online though, and I was actually in the stream with him and a bunch of others because these group of white bringers seem to like include me in and just liked having like a diversity of opinions as it were. And I was a left wing or vaguely socialist essentially, and I was included in, and I didn't stay along in that group. But not knowing this person was a anarcho-capitalist, someone brought up anarcho-capitalists in the discussion. I said, anarcho-capitalists are just big babies who don't want to pay taxes. He smirked. But yeah, anarcho-capitalists. I call them ANCRAPs. Just. If need to, I can definitely explain how anarcho-capitalists are not anarchists in two ways. But still, when I first became involved in anarchist politics, therefore, I was surprised to discover that not only did the overwhelming majority of activists who consider themselves anarchists not identify with any of these positions, many were not even aware of them. Others who do read the magazines read them mainly for entertainment value. Elsewhere, I was referred to these non-sectarians as small a anarchists to distinguish them from those who identify with any one particular strain. Green anarchism, individualism, anarcho-syndicalism, that's what I am, post-leftist, platformist, and so on. I'll tell you this much: is I'm not too familiar with what the platformers are. I think I'm sort of familiar with like a post-leftists are. Green anarchists are comrades, and they're very cool. They're just like more focused on the eco-socialism side of this, or like the green politics, so trying to have save the environment or save a habitat. A environment that's hospitable to us and that we can habitate into, and that is renewable as well. Individualists, I think, not sure about individualists. I know of equalists and their comrades. I would definitely say that, but it's just I'm not sure it's something I would actually follow. They don't mention anarcho-communists, which is anarcho-syndicalists are basically anarcho-communists who just anarcho-syndicalists focus on our workers' councils and democracy at the workplace and orientating in that, while anarcho-communists are just more generally just ANCOMs that want to see anarcho-communism happen in the world eventually, as well, maybe in their lifetime. Anyway, I'll continue. All statistics are unavailable. Chuck Mushin, who occasionally surveys those who frequent infoshop.com, possibly the most popular anarchist website in North America, informs me that about 90% of American anarchists would seem to fit into a small a category, since only 10% are willing to identify themselves as any particular subset. I know. I'll go and type infoshop.com into the chat for those who look it up. Let's see if that works. And seems to work in some kind of hyperlink somewhere. Not sure if we'll actually post something up. But yeah. So is there if anyone wants to check it out. If that works. It doesn't. Oh, okay, no. It just was taking too long for it to respond on my end. That's because I am actually streaming, so I will just chalk it up to that and be grateful that I'm still streaming. But I do, so it does make sense for people to just say that they're anarchists without actually seeing what they are specifically. I used to say I'm an anarcho-communist, but now I just say I'm anarcho-syndicalist. They're more or less the same thing. There is a branch of anarchism that's anarchism without adjectives, and it's a whole thing. They actually do express themselves as just anarchists as opposed to some kind of specific anarchist. Anyway, what's more, even many of those who identify themselves with any one particular strand acts in ways that would be impossible to understand if we we're dealing with a political ideology in anything like the traditional sense of the term. Let me take one example. Primalism. Well, first of all, fuck pluralism, but we'll continue. Perhaps the most obvious auteur. In America, primalist ideas first began to take forms in circles surrounding a journal called The Fifth Estate in Detroit in the 1970s and 1980s. The argument began as a synthesis of certain strands of Marxism with ideas first accumulated by socialist hierarchies such as Jacqueline Elou and Jacqueline Camanti. I apologize if I butchered those pronunciations. Who came to see the nature of technology itself as lying at the core of most of what Marx saw as alienating and oppressive, about capital, and thus reject the idea that the proletariat, as an essential part of the global mecha machine, could possibly be the agent of a revolution. Millet, 2004. As part of a broader critique developing around the time of the production basis in traditional leftist thought, it is hard to see this as anything but being perfectly normal debate. By the 1990s, however, the most aggressive strain of primalist thought began to coalesce around the figure of John Zanzia, one-time ultra-leftist who began expressing utter hostility not only to the left but to society itself. Zanzin basically took the most radical position and that it was possible to take, arguing that everything from plant I know some things are like slow to respond. Hopefully not like my stream is fine as well. Hopefully my things don't stutter. I'm watching my stream and back and make sure that that's the case. Assuming that things haven't like stuttered and so on, it looks like it has. Okay. Arguing that everything from like plant domestication to music, writing, math, art, and ultimately even speech, basically all forms of symbolic representation, anything other than absolute, direct, unmitigated experiences, were really forms of alienations that could only be overcome through the destruction of civilization in its entirety, and a return to the Stone Age. Yeah, we call this kind of like people's also like anti-civilization, like anti-civ, and yeah, I know I don't agree with those kind of people. We discussed this on Social Justice Achlemy, and I've been meaning to like take that part and clip it and make it into his own YouTube video because I thought it was a good discussion all around. It said how terrible that idea would be for the majority of people, because if we just revert all the way back to hunter-gatherer scavenger societies that anarcho-permanentism wants to, which is why they're anti-civilizationist, then that will just like reduce the world's population by like 1/8 to 1/8. Or less, and that the life expectancy will go through the floor. And it's inherently ableist, which is not really anarchism, because anarchism are, I guess, the coercive justifiable hierarchies of ableism, and because it's so many people do need like the benefits from the current society and technology to be able to live a full life, and just the medications alone for many people's different like elements of chronic pain or from rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia or even like mental illnesses as well. Or for trans people, there are many people that need like HRT in order to like transition to feel fully comfortable in their bodies at their work. So yeah, I'll continue. Now, the influence of zines on anarchism has been considerably overstated in the media, but there's a significant number of green anarchists who takes these ideas very seriously. These green anarchists produce any number of zines and journals that aggressively touts these ideas, engaging in constant vitriolic debates with anyone willing to cast doubt on any aspects of ultra-primalist positions. Oh, let's look at the note. Yes. Because that's the thing. I respect green anarchists as basically like eco-anarchists or eco-socialists that are anarchists as well. Primalists I do not respect. So the note says, Zanzibar became famous immediately after Seattle, in part because all journalists suddenly wanted to speak to an anarchist, and he was the only one. He was the only one Med Ooze had in their Rolodex, since he was for a while a suspect in the Unabomber case. So they know him because of like Ted Kaczynski. The idea of a return to the Paleolithic, the rejection of plant domestication, let alone language, is obviously absurd. It would require reducing the Earth's population by at least 99.9%. Nor are primitives entirely unaware of this. The Fifth Estate people had long debate about the problem back in the 1970s. The editors coming to the conclusion that since they didn't really wish to see a global catastrophe such as a nuclear war, the best one could hope for was a gradual process of negative population growth. Okay, so just encouraging people not to have babies. Well, the current economic system of capitalism is already doing that. Many Zoomers and like millennials are saying that they don't want to have children because of the catastrophe of climate change. Sorry to bring that down on people and mentioning that sort of things. So they only want. So the primitives is. So the editors of the Fifth Estate would like say, listen, let's just like the narco-permanents in society we want won't happen in our lifetimes. We have to wait to avoid catastrophe. We have to wait for the numbers of people to reduce down to a relative like a good level, negative population growth. If people don't want to have like children, that's definitely their prerogative and their choice. Absolutely. Most current primitives seem to alternate between overly espousing industrial and demographic collapse. I have heard some argue that humankind is a virus which needs to be largely eradicated. That's why I hate Burmese. Two, in defiance of all logic and common sense, denying that massive population decline would even be necessary. Okay. Zanzine often does this before non-anarchist audiences. No, we're not going to have a massive populist economy. It'll just all work out by magic. At the time, those authors were regularly denounced and denounce anyone who advocates the classic anarchist strategy of building a new society in the shelf of the old. They ridicule any talk of slow, painful creation of new institutions as outmoded leftism, arguing that only the complete destruction of all existing structures and institutions, followed by a return to our instinctual wildness, could possibly bring about liberation. But again, so ableist because if anyone can't they do that sort of thing, what's going to happen to them? My proposal here is not to critique the permanentist position. This is obviously pointless. It is clearly it made no sense to attack any strategy other than waiting for catastrophe, and then deny one is advocating catastrophe. My real point is, if this were a classic ideological position, one should expect the effects to be utterly demoralizing. If one were looking forward to industrial collapse or one similar apocalypse, the most obvious course of action would be that followed by right-wing survivalists in the 1980s. Yeah. Take to the woods, dig a bunker, and begin stockpiling canned foods and automatic weapons. Or, alternatively, perhaps find a distant island and try to begin and reviving Stone Age technology. To my knowledge, no proponent of green anarchism has ever done anything of either sort. Instead, they tend to act very much like any other anarchists. Pluralists may be more likely to be involved in ecological or animal rights campaigns than in, say, union organizing, but in New York, for instance, I know towards green anarchists who worked with the Independent Media Center, and Dan and video collectives, Food Not Bombs chapters, community gardens, prison support networks, feminist groups, bicycle campaigns, squats, cooperative bookstores, anti-war campaigns, campaigns for the rights of immigrants, housing rights, cop watch programs, pretty much every other major manifestation of anarchist organizing. Often, in fact, Primalists turned out to be amongst the most reliable and dedicated activists around. I still don't agree with the Primalist ideology, but I will count green anarchists as comrades. I personally separate the two, even though David Graeber in this section seems to basically say primitives are the same as green anarchists, and if they work out and all these kind of things and participate in all this kind of programs and do good for the world as a whole, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna denounce that and say no, don't do all that sort of thing. They don't do good for the world. If they're doing good for the world, okay, good for them actually. I still won't agree with anarcho-permanist worldview, though. Anyway, confronted with this sort of contradiction, it's hard to avoid asking the same question even protests ask about Zoe and witchcraft. How can otherwise reasonable people claim to believe this sort of thing? If one points out some of these contradictions to actual advocates of primalism, for instance, asking them to reflect on what would happen if the population of, say, Bangladesh were to one day decide to stop participating in practicing aviculture, the usual response would be that, but it's not a program, it's a critique. Alternatively, they might challenge the very logical pragmatic terms of the argument and insist that this is poetic. Intuitive understanding about the state of the world that is fundamentally dislocated and wrong. Similarly, even the most avid fans of Senzian will usually admit, if pressed, that they aren't really in favor of the abolishing of language. That's right, that's what, according to David Graeber, that's what Senzian is all about. But instead emphasize the degree to which one language can be decisive, ideological, or mask and opulent, more direct forms of experience. I mean, there's definitely arguments to be made about better ways to communicate with each other, but that would be for me to actually, study other languages so that I can actually more accurate, more be able to communicate with others. Not to get rid of language. Good hot water leaf juice. All this, I think, does much to explain the appeal and the reason primitivism tends towards such absolutes. It is really an attempt to take absolutely seriously those feelings of other alienation that drives so many middle-class white teenagers to anarchism in the first place, and to at least try to imagine a world in which every aspect of alienation would be totally extinguished. The results can only be a kind of myth. Primalists would often admit this too, claiming that the widespread myths of apocalypse and the Garden of Eden are intuitively understandings of real truths. Okay? That we once did live in a kind of paradise and that we've lost it. And that though a catastrophic collapse of industrial society, we will get it back again. The myth of apocalypse comes to a substitute for the faith in revolution. It is, in a way, the same thing. Expressed more absolute, the tradition of anarchist rejection of political representation becomes a rejection of representation in any form, even art or language. For most primitivists, this is what we mainly dealing with: a comprehensive critique of alienated institutions and a kind of impossible dream vision of total liberation that can, if nothing else, provide inspiration and continually remind one why one is in rebellion to begin with. For many, the fact that this makes no sense whatsoever to outsiders is probably a major element in its appeal. Let me take an apparent very different example. One of the main forms of dissemination of anarchist ideas in recent years in America has been feminist science fiction novels, from Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed to Star Talk's The Fixed Sacred Thing. They operate in a similar way. They are crystallized of certain tendencies of thought extrapolations, and certain forms of practices, experiments in utopian imagining. The main difference that since the visions developed in novels are not claiming to be anything but fiction, those who enjoy reading or writing them do not tend to claim alternative versions are wrong. In the case of green anarchism, the vitriol quality of so much of the writing seems to result from the confluence of two factors. On one hand, the urgency of the ecological cause, the sense that the planet is being destroyed, and we are all doomed anyway if something isn't done very quickly. Sadly, yes. And a certain habit of extreme consensus arguing inherent from the sectarian and Marxist origins of so many of the original participants. Let's go to note 19 about that. And over in the next page, as you hear some bings from my phone. One might say, in fact, that Zanzi's or Bob Black's endless blanket denunciation of leftism are themselves an extreme version of one tendency within a very leftism they condemn. I heard about Bob Black from some of my comrades. They don't have favorable opinions of his writings, essentially. In this, there are unusual. As I mentioned, anarchists have long tended to shun high theory. As David Hayek put it in 1971, long before anyone had thought of the term postmodernism. Anarchism has always been anti-intellectual. Anarchists have always insisted on the priority of life and action to theory and system. Subjection to a theory implies, in practice, subjection to an authority, a party, which interprets the theory authoritarianly, and this subjection would finally undermine the intention of creating a society without certain political authority. Thus, no anarchist writings are authoritative or definite in the sense that hello, how are you doing? And welcome in. I'm reading some David Graeber's Direct Action An Ethnography, and we're in the section of What is Anarchism? The election was the election. Thus, no anarchist writings are authoritative or definitive in the sense that Marxist writings has been regarded by his followers. In fact, most of what serves the same roles as theory in anarchism this is not the topic of the discussion that we're having. Please you keep it on the focus. But it's the Middle East policies in the Middle East going back to under normal democratic leadership. Yeah, I'm reading David Graeber. I did like Bullshit Jobs a lot. I thought his book Bullshit Jobs was really good. I did actually read that book. But beyond the democratic leadership, this country, I call this country the United Corporations of Imperialism, and imperialist corporations of white supremacy. And so, is Biden be more presidential as he issues drone strikes in the Middle East and bombs those kind of places? I don't know if the people of Iraq will see a difference. And to be honest, since we bomb the Middle East so often, I think the Middle East have a right to vote in America's elections, if you ask me. But I'll continue. In fact, most of what serves as the same role as theory in anarchism is make some gestures to subvert any possibilities of it being used as authoritative text. Primalism, perhaps most closely resemble a traditional sectarian ideology, is trying to vanish all opposing positions, but its content is palpable fantastic, and for the most part could not possibly be reflected in practice. Some visions take the form of novels, other read comedy routines. One of the most popular anarchist authors of the 1990s, the inventor, for instance, of the concept of the temporarily autonomous zones, writes under the persona of Hegron Bey, a insane Islamilian poet with an erotic obsession with young boys. His writings take the form of communistic from a non-existent Moorish Orthodox Church. Bayes' mythical pretension typifies another tendency to identify the space that might otherwise be filled by theory. The transactional position, as it were, with the sacred, but then to make the sacred ridiculous. I'll be talking about this habit later on when I discuss the role of giant puppets, what might be called the main sacred objects of the movement, but also self-consciously foolish ones. Here, sufficient to say that the relations of anarchism to spirituality has always been complex and abundant. In the 19th century, early 20th centuries, in the 19th and early 20th century, European anarchists also tend to be like strongest in countries, Russia, Spain, Italy, with a powerful church, and tend to like take on a radical atheist tone, identifying the very notion of God with the principle of hierarchy and unquestioned authority. So becomes a famous phrase: if God really exists, it would be necessary to abolish him. And there was like exceptions, Christian anarchists like Tolstoy, but there were usually not closely related to social movements. The Bakunin's God and State is an interesting book. Some have argued that Spanish anarchism, particularly in the rural manifestations, itself took on some of the qualities of a periodic millennialism millenarian religion. Burroughs 1943 and Bakunin's 1937. But if so, it was one of the main rituals involved acts like burning churches or removing the mummified bodies of nuns and from the church creeps and to reveal the corruption lurking below. Lincoln, 1991. In contemporary anarchism, this hostility has largely faded away, in part because in many countries the church has lost so much of its power, in part because so many anarchist allies, indigenous people, for example, in the United States, Quakers, radical priests, and ministers, are likely to have come to their policies through religious convictions, in part too because of the development of specialized anarchist forms of spirituality, such as the feminist paganism. At the same time, specifically anarchist forms of spirituality are, in addition to being inherently pluralistic and open-ended, hence the polytheism, also at least a trifle self-effacing and capable of dissing themselves. And go to note 20. Oh, went right here. Barbara Inston was already puzzling over the phenomenon when discussing the role of feminists and spirituality in the direct action movement of the early 1980s. The fact that many pagans simultaneously believe in goddess as reality and the goddess as metaphor for the power of human collective and human bonds with nature. In the same way, many participants in the direct action movement have simultaneously held naive and some spontaneous concepts of magical politics. Eston's 1981, page 184, by which she means both the belief that a blockade in and of itself can shut down a nuclear plant, and that it can rise conscientiously and change the public's frameworks of understanding in such a way that it can contribute to its closing. Actually, I argued elsewhere that this kind of doublethink is typical of magical practice pretty much anywhere, from Madagascar to Nepal. Graeber, 2002. What was his book in 2002? Or his writings in 2002? Because I read fragments of an anthropologist anarchist, but I don't know if I read his 2002 work. He wrote a book about his experiences in Madagascar. I'm interested in reading that. But yeah, I figured that David would take this stance as well, because he also mentioned in the diary portions of the book, I think in chapter 3, where he talked to a Quaker about how there's their methodology of of like performing meetings is similar to like anarchist ways, but because there's an inherent spiritual essence to it, there's kind of like certain rules that like Quakers have that anarchists don't, about like it's inappropriate or you cannot talk back, as it were, when it's a, because it is a spiritual kind of like setting, as it were. But I'll continue. And so that's kind of also why it's kind of interesting. Is because of studying leftism or other kind of, or feminism or even like anarchism, I have softened my views on like religion, as it were. I I used to be like in my 20s one of those like terrible people of the like new atheist kind of like breed of just like, oh, religion is stupid, you shouldn't be religious and all that. I definitely greatly softened my position there, in that like no, it's not a problem of like people's religious beliefs, especially since like it's mostly they're just personal faith. It's all personal. It's just their faith and all. It's more or less institutions that are trying to impose their religious teachings onto like others. That's the part that like I have to be against. The institutions that are trying to impose and oppress other people. As well as like any kind of like a religious person that wants to bring their religious teachings of whatever they are into the law, and that I disagree with. That's where many examples in like the Americas. It's fundamentalists that I'm against, and I'm against the fundamentalists trying to like bring that into the law. That's where separation of church and states and all. Where it should be we should be a sectarian, secular nation, but in practice we're kind of really not. Anyway, many pagans have a striking ability to see their views as profoundly true, and simultaneously as a kind of whimsical comedy. Often they seem to be engaging at the same time in the ritual and the parody of ritual, the point where laughter and self-mockery are likeliness to come into... Thank you, moderator. And coming to the picture is precisely the point where one approaches the most numerous, unknowable, or profound. The same whimsical, playful quality is reflected in a good deal of pagan feminist literature, as in like other branches of anarchist-like theory, and approaches to reflect a... No problem. Food is good. A sensibility that at best sees theory as, if anything, a form of creative writing. Both are profoundly true because it highlights certain otherwise invisible aspects of reality, but as at the same time profoundly foolish, in that it does so being willingly blind to other aspects. And here's another note at number 21. As Bob Black put it in The Abolishment of Work, you may be wondering if I'm joking or serious. I'm joking and serious. I'm sometimes like that too when I say certain things. Also, in one which imagination, the ability to create new theories, visions, or anything else, it is itself the ultimate unknowable sacred thing. And all of this perhaps is a bit overstated. The reader should probably not take their own theoretical effigies to much more serious than those which I am writing. The main point, though, is that unlike some of the classic works of Proudhon, Kropotkin, Rocker, Miltesa, De Centilla, and others, written in the shadows of Marxism, contemporary anarchist theory, such as it is most especially not intended to provide a comprehensive understanding that will instruct others in the proper conduct of revolution. Yeah, paganism can be pretty base. Yeah, actually, I have met pagans as well, and they seem to like take their teachings from them, and kind of like they never realized that like it was absorbed in and warped into like their way of life, or how they conduct themselves with others. It most explicitly not intended to provide a comprehensive understanding that will instruct others in the proper conduct of revolution. It is not an ideology; it's a theory of history. It's a theory of history. It tends rather towards a kind of inspirational creative play. Welcome to Falls and welcome into the stream. It is more than anything else a extra. Okay, I saw that word before, and I was like, I thought I know how to spell it or how to pronounce it, but I'm gonna try actually typing it in because otherwise I'll just make further of a fool of itself, which I already do anyway. You should see the hats I have. Let's go to Webster because they usually have pronunciation thing as well. Did I click on it?
Extrapolate.
Extrapolate. Oh, I heard that word before, but I've never seen it in print. Anyway. So, and it's more is that it is more than anything else an extrapolation form and imaginative projection of certain forms of practice. The experiencing of working in affinity groups becomes the model for primalism ideations and of hunter-gatherer bands. Assumed to be the only social unit for most of human history, the experience of real experiments in worker controls become the basis of an imaginary planet in a science fiction story. The experience of sisterhood becomes the model of a matriarchal goddess religion. The experience of a wild movement of collective poetic inspirations, or even a particular good party, becomes the basis of a theory of the temporary autonomous zone. That's exactly what happened in Seattle, actually, in June, I think, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the Capitol Hill Open Protest. That's exactly how it happened. That was actually a neighborhood in Seattle people lived there, and there's a police station there, and it was during the unrest and the uprising against police brutality and the murder of George Floyd, right? And they finally just actually took over the police station on Capitol Hill, and so that's when they created the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone and the Capitol Hill Open Protest. I'll continue. Even when contemporary anarchists turn to Marxism, they are overwhelmingly favor theories such as the Situationists, Rio Adventures in 1967 and Guy Debord in 1967. The Marxist theorists closest to the avant-garde tradition of trying to unify theory, art, and life. If anarchism is not an attempt to put a certain sort of theatrical vision into practice, theoretical vision into practice, but it is instead a constant mutual exchange between inspirational visions and authoritarian attitudes and egalitarian practices, it is easy to see how ethnography can become such an appropriate tool for analysis. This is precisely what ethnography is supposed to do: tease out the implicit logic in a way of life, along with related myths and rituals, to grasp the sense of a set of practices. Of course, another way of doing so would be simply to follow anarchist debates, as I did at the beginning, since they have tended to center on ethical organizations' questions. Nowadays, these debates center most of all on how to combat racism, sexism in the movements, and about forms of decision-making and questions of violence and non-violence. Since the last is most eminently relevant to the question of relations of anarchism and direct action, let's proceed to a brief consideration of the relationship between the two, before moving to capsulate the history of the role of direct action and direct democracy in North America's social movements in the second half of the 20th century, starting with the 1960s and ending in the 1990s, at the point where the two became to definitively merge. So how long I've been streaming? I have taken a break about an hour in. We're now 2 hours and 40 minutes in. Good time for another break. I might make myself another cup of hot water leaf juice. So now, all those that are here and all those that are still watching, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Duke of Falls, for coming. Thank you for Nazaneco for coming. And I'm going to we're going to do a self-care break now. So if you have like medications that you haven't taken, go and take the medication. No problem, Ness. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy doing this kind of streaming. This is the reason why I'm doing that kind of streaming. My laptops can easily do this. I just have this thing open and I'm not running any other programs of the game. There's just nothing just chugging that's like it's difficult to do. But I also do actually enjoy reading this kind of books and reading this kind of theory. I don't do it regularly enough though. On my own. But this is kind of a way for me to do it, and also a way for me to like more engage in like the theory much more easily. In that, like I can retain it much better, and so that's why I enjoy doing it. But I'll come back to that, and we'll have a self-care break. So get up, stretch, make another like a cup of like hot and water leaf juice if you want. Get some self snacks, take your medication, stretch, use the facilities. I'm gonna no wait. Did I transition over to like my starting soon screen in my first break instead of the be right back screen? Professional. I think I did. And, well, hey, no one noticed. And it's just like, then it'll be like, hey, we're starting soon. And it's fine. So we're actually going to transition over to the be right back screen, not starting soon screen. And I'm going to take a break and be right back.